Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Kidnapped, chapters 23 and 24. Chapter 23, Clooney's Cage. We came at last to the foot of an exceeding steep wood which scrambled up a craggy hillside and was crowned by a naked precipice. "It's here," said one of the guides, and we struck uphill. The trees clung upon the slope like sailors on the shrouds of a ship, and their trunks were like the rounds of a ladder by which we mounted. Quite at the top, and just before the rocky face of the cliff sprang above the foliage, we found that strange house which was known in the country as Clooney's Cage. The trunks of several trees had been wattled across, the intervals strengthened with stakes, and the ground behind this barricade leveled up with earth to make the floor. A tree which grew out from the hillside was the living center beam of the roof. The walls were of wattle and covered with moss. The whole house had something of an egg shape, and it half hung, half stood in that steep hillside thicket like a wasp's nest in a green hawthorn. Within, it was large enough to shelter 5 or 6 persons with some comfort. A projection of the cliff had been cunningly employed to be the fireplace, and the smoke rising against the face of the rock and being not dissimilar in color readily escaped notice from below. This was but one of Clooney's hiding places. He had caves besides, and underground chambers in several parts of his country, and following the reports of his scouts, he moved from one to another as the soldiers drew near or moved away. By this manner of living, and thanks to the affection of his clan, he had not only stayed all this time in safety, while so many others had fled or been taken and slain, but stayed 4 or 5 years longer, and only went to France at last by the express command of his master. There he soon died, and it is strange to reflect that he may have regretted his cage upon Ben Alder. Excuse me. When we came to the door, he was seated by his rock chimney, watching a gilly about some cookery. He was mighty plainly habited, with a knitted nightcap drawn over his ears, and smoked a foul cuddy pipe. For all that he had the manners of a king, and it was quite a sight to see him rise out of his place to welcome us. "Well, Mr. Stewart, come away, sir," said he, "and bring in your friend that as yet I dinna ken the name of." "And how is yourself, Clooney?" said Allan. "I hope you do brawly, sir, and I am proud to see ye, and to present to you my friend the Laird of Shaw's, Mr. David Balfour." Allan never referred to my estate without a touch of a sneer when we were alone, but with strangers he rang the words out like a herald. "Step in by, the both of you, gentlemen," says Clooney. "I make you welcome to my house, which is a queer, rude place for certain, but one where I have entertained a royal personage, Mr. Stewart. You doubtless ken the personage I have in my eye. We'll take a dram for luck, and as soon as this handless man of mine has the collops ready, we'll dine and take a hand at the carts as gentlemen should. My life is a bit drey," says he, pouring out the brandy. "I see little company, and sit and twirl my thumbs, and mind upon a great day that is gone by, and weary for another great day that we all hope will be upon the road. And so here's a toast to you, the Restoration." Thereupon we all touched glasses and drank. I am sure I wished no ill to King George, and if he had been there himself in proper person, it's like he would have done as I did. No sooner had I taken out the dram than I felt hugely better, and could look on and listen, still a little mistily perhaps, but no longer with the same groundless horror and distress of mind. It was certainly a strange place, and we had a strange host. In his long hiding, Clooney had grown to have all manner of precise habits like those of an old maid. He had a particular place where no one else must sit. The cage was arranged in a particular way, which none must disturb. Cookery was one of his chief fancies, and even while he was greeting us in, he kept an eye to the collops. It appears he sometimes visited or received visits from his wife and 1 or 2 of his nearest friends under the cover of night, but for the more part lived quite alone and communicated only with the sentinels and the gillies that waited on him in the cage. The first thing in the morning, one of them, who was a barber, came and shaved him and gave him the news of the country, of which he was immoderately greedy. There was no end to his questions. He put them as earnestly as a child, and at some of the answers laughed out of all bounds of reason, and would break out again laughing at the mere memory hours after the barber was gone. To be sure, there might have been a purpose in his questions, for though he was thus sequestered, and like the other landed gentlemen of Scotland stripped by the late Act of Parliament of legal powers, he still exercised a patriarchal justice in his clan. Disputes were brought to him in his hiding hole to be decided, and the men of his country, who would have snapped their fingers at the court of session, laid aside revenge and paid down money at the bare word of this forfeited and hunted outlaw. When he was angered, which was often enough, He gave his commands and breathed threats of punishment like any king, and his gillies trembled and crouched away from him like children before a hasty father. With each of them, as he entered, he ceremoniously shook hands, both parties touching their bonnets at the same time in a military manner. Altogether, I had a fair chance to see some of the inner workings of a Highland clan, and this with a proscribed fugitive chief, his country conquered, the troops riding upon all sides in quest of him, sometimes within a mile of where he lay, and when the least of the ragged fellows whom he raided and threatened could have made a fortune by betraying him. On that first day, as soon as the collops were ready, Cluny gave them with his own hand a squeeze of a lemon, for he was well supplied with luxuries, and bade us to draw in to our meal. They, said he, meaning the collops, are such as I gave his Royal Highness in this very house, bating the lemon juice, for at that time we were glad to get the meat and never fashed for kitchen. Indeed, there were mair dragoons than lemons in my country in the year 46. I do not know if the collops were truly very good, but my heart rose against the sight of them, and I could eat but little. All the while, Cluny entertained us with stories of Prince Charlie's stay in the cage, giving us the very words of the speakers, and rising from his place to show us where they stood. By these, I gathered the prince was a gracious, spirited boy like the son of a race of polite kings, but not so wise as Solomon. I gathered, too, that while he was in the cage he was often drunk, so the fault that has since, by all accounts, made such a wreck of him had even then begun to show itself. We were no sooner done eating than Cluny brought out an old, thumbed, greasy pack of cards, such as you may find in a mean inn, and his eyes brightened in his face as he proposed that we should fall to playing. Now this was one of the things I had been brought up to eschew like disgrace, it being held by my father neither the part of a Christian nor yet of a gentleman to set his own livelihood and fish for that of others on the cast of painted cardboard. To be sure, I might have pleaded my fatigue, which was excuse enough, but I thought it behoved that I should bear a testimony. I must have got very red in the face, but I spoke steadily and told them I had no call to be a judge of others, but for my own part it was a matter in which I had no clearness. Excuse me. Cluny stopped mingling the cards. "What in devil's name is this?" says he. "What kind of Whiggish canting talk is this, for the house of Cluny Macpherson?" "I will put my hand in the fire for Mr. Balfour," says Allan. "He is an honest and a metal gentleman, and I would have ye bear in mind who says it. I bear a king's name," says he, cocking his hat, "and I and any that I call friend are company for the best. But the gentleman is tired and should sleep. If he has no mind to the cards, it will never hinder you and me, and I'm fit and willing, sir, to play ye any game that ye can name." "Sir," says Cluny, "in this poor house of mine, I would have you to ken that any gentleman may follow his pleasure. If your friend would like to stand on his head, he is welcome, and if either he or you or any other man is not precisely satisfied, I will be proud to step outside with him." I had no will that these two friends should cut their throats for my sake. "Sir," said I am very wearied, as Allan says, and what's more, as you are a man that likely has sons of your own, I may tell you it was a promise to my father." Say no more, said Cluny, and he pointed me to a bed of heather in a corner of the cage. For all that he was displeased enough, looked at me askance and grumbled when he looked. And indeed it must be owned that both my scruples and the words in which I declared them smacked somewhat of the Covenanter, and were little in their place among wild Highland Jacobites. What with the brandy and the venison, a strange heaviness had come over me, and I had scarce lain down upon the bed before I fell into a kind of trance, in which I continued almost the whole time of our stay in the cage. Excuse me. Sometimes I was broad awake and understood what passed. Sometimes I only heard voices or men snoring like the voice of a silly river, and the plaids upon the wall dwindled down and swelled out again like firelight shadows on the roof. I must sometimes have spoken or cried out, for I remember I was now and then amazed at being answered. Yet I was conscious of no particular nightmare, only of a general black abiding horror, a horror of the place I was in, and the bed I lay in, and the plaids on the wall, and the voices, and the fire, and myself. The barber Gilly, who was a doctor too, was called in to prescribe for me, but as he spoke in Gaelic I understood not a word of his opinion, and was too sick even to ask for a translation. I knew well enough I was ill, and that was all I cared about. I paid little heed while I lay in this poor pass, but Allen and Clooney were most of the time at the cards, and I am clear that Allen must have begun by winning, for I remember sitting up and seeing them hard at it, and a great glittering pile of as much as 60 or 100 guineas on the table. It looked strange enough to see all this wealth in a nest upon a cliffside wattled about growing trees, and even then I thought it seemed deep water for Allen to be riding, who had no better battle horse than a green purse and a matter of 5 pounds. And luck, it seems, changed on the second day. About noon I was wakened as usual for dinner, and as usual refused to eat, and was given a dram with some bitter infusion which the barber had prescribed. The sun was shining in at the open door of the cage, and this dazzled and offended me. Clooney sat at the table, biting the pack of cards. Allen had stooped over the bed, and had his face close to my eyes, to which, troubled as they were with fever, it seemed of the most shocking bigness. He asked me for a loan of my money. "What for?" said I. "Oh, just for a loan," he said. "But why?" I repeated. "I don't see." "Hut, David," said Allen, "you wouldn't have grudged me a loan?" I would, though, if I had had my senses, but all I thought of then was to get his face away, and I handed him my money. On the morning of the third day, when we had been 48 hours in the cage, I awoke with a great relief of spirits, very weak and weary indeed, but seeing things of the right size with their honest everyday appearance. I had a mind to eat, moreover, rose from bed of my own movement, and as soon as we had breakfasted, stepped to the entry of the cage and sat down outside in the top of the wood. It was a gray day with a cool, mild air, and I sat in a dream all morning, only disturbed by the passing by of Clooney's scouts and servants coming with provisions and reports. For as the coast was at the time clear, you might almost say he held court openly. When I returned, he and Allen had laid the cards aside and were questioning a gillie, and the chief turned about and spoke to me in the Gaelic. "I have no Gaelic, sir," said I. Now, since the card question, everything I said or did had the power of annoying Clooney. "Your name has more sense than yourself, then," said he angrily, "for it's good Gaelic. But the point is this. My scout report's all clear in the south, and the question is, have you the strength to go?" I saw cards on the table, but no gold. Only a heap of little written papers, and these all on Clooney's side. Allen, besides, had an odd look, like a man not very well content, and I began to have a strong misgiving. "I do not know if I am as well as I should be," said I, looking at Allen, "but the little money we have has a long way to carry us." Allen took his underlip into his mouth and looked upon the ground. "David," says he at last, "I've lost it. There's the naked truth." "My money too?" said I. "Your money too," says Allen with a groan. "You shouldn't have given it to me. I'm daft when I get to the carts." "Hoot toot," said Clooney. "It was all daffling. It's all nonsense. Of course you'll have your money back again, and the double of it if you'll make so free with me. It would be a singular thing for me to keep it. It's not to be supposed that I would be any hindrance to gentlemen in your situation. That would be a singular thing," cries he, and began to pull gold out of his pocket with a mighty red face. Allen said nothing, only looked on the ground. "Will you step to the door with me, sir?" said I. Clooney said he would be very glad, and followed me readily enough, but he looked flustered and put out. "And now, sir," says I must first acknowledge your generosity." "Nonsensical nonsense," cries Clooney. "Where's the generosity? This is just a most unfortunate affair. But what would ye have me do, boxed up in this beast kep of a cage of mine, but just set my friends to the carts when I can get them? And if they lose, of course, it's not to be supposed," and here he came to a pause. "Yes," said I, "if they lose, you give them back their money, and if they win, they carry away yours in their pouches. I have said before that I grant your generosity, but to me, sir, it's a very painful thing to be placed in this position." There was a little silence in which Clooney seemed always as if he was about to speak, but said nothing. All the time he grew redder and redder in the face. "I am a young man," said I, "and I ask your advice. Advise me as you would your son. My friend fairly lost this money after having fairly gained a far greater sum of yours. Can I accept it back again? Would that be the right part for me to play? Whatever I do, you can see for yourself it must be hard upon a man of any pride." "It's rather hard on me too, Mr. Balfour," said Clooney. and you give me very much the look of a man that has entrapped poor people to their hurt. I wouldn't have my friends come to any house of mine to accept affronts. No, he cried with a sudden heat of anger, nor yet to give them. And so you see, sir, said I, there is something to be said upon my side, and this gambling is a very poor employ for gentlefolks. But I am still waiting your opinion. I am sure if ever Clooney hated any man, it was David Balfour. He looked me all over with a warlike eye, and I saw the challenge at his lips. But either my use disarmed him, or perhaps his own sense of justice. Certainly it was a mortifying matter for all concerned, and not least for Clooney, the more credit that he took it as he did. Mr. Balfour, said he, I think you are too nice and covenanting, but for all that you have the spirit of a pretty, very pretty gentleman. Upon my honest word, you may take this money, and it's what I would tell my son, and here's my hand along with it. Chapter 24. The Flight in the Heather, the Quarrel. Allen and I were put across Loch Errocht under cloud of night, and went down its eastern shore to another hiding place near the head of Loch Rannoch, whither we were led by one of the gillies from the cage. This fellow carried all our luggage and Allen's greatcoat in the bargain, trotting along under the burden, far less than the half of which used to weigh me to the ground, like a stout hill pony with a feather. Yet he was a man that in plain contest I could have broken on my knee. Doubtless it was a great relief to walk disencumbered, and perhaps without that relief, and the consequent sense of liberty and lightness, I could not have walked at all. I was but new arisen from a bed of sickness, and there was nothing in the state of our affairs to hearten me for much exertion. Traveling as we did over the most dismal deserts in Scotland under a cloudy heaven and with divided hearts among the travelers. For long we said nothing, marching alongside or one behind the other, each with a set countenance. I, angry and proud, and drawing what strength I had from these two violent and sinful feelings. Allen, angry and ashamed that he had lost my money, angry that I should take it so ill. The thought of a separation ran always the stronger in my mind, and the more I approved of it, the more ashamed I grew of my approval. It would be a fine, handsome, generous thing indeed for Allen to turn round and say to me, Go, I am in the most danger, and my company only increases yours. But for me to turn to the friend who certainly loved me and say to him, You are in great danger, I am in but little, your friendship is a burden. Go, take your risks, and bear your hardships alone. No, that was impossible, and even to think of it privately to myself made my cheeks to burn. And yet Allen had behaved like a child, and what is worse, a treacherous child. Wheedling my money from me while I lay half-conscious was scarce better than theft, and yet here he was trudging by my side without a penny to his name, and by what I could see, quite blithe to sponge upon the money he had driven me to beg. True, I was ready to share it with him, but it made me rage to see him count upon my readiness. These were the two things uppermost in my mind, and I could open my mouth upon neither without black ungenerosity. So I did the next worst, and said nothing, nor so much as looked once at my companion, save with the tail of my eye. At last, upon the other side of Loch Errocht, going over a smooth, rushy place, where the walking was easy, he could bear it no longer, and came close to me. David, says he, this is no way for two friends to take a small accident. I have to say that I'm sorry, and so that's said. And now if you have anything, you'd better say it. Oh, says I have nothing. He seemed disconcerted, at which I was meanly pleased. No, said he, with rather a trembling voice, but when I say I was to blame? Why, of course you were to blame, said I coolly, and you will bear me out that I have never reproached you. Never, says he, but you can very well that you've done worse. Are we to part? You said so once before. Are you to say it again? There's hills and heather enough between here and the two seas, David, and I will own I'm no very keen to stay where I'm no wanted. This pierced me like a sword, and it seemed to lay bare my private disloyalty. Allen Breck, I cried, and then, do you think I am one to turn my back on you in your chief need? You durst say it to my face. My whole conduct's there to give the lie to it. It's true, I fell asleep upon the muir, but that was from weariness, and you do wrong to cast it up to me. Which is what I never did, said Allen. But aside from that, I continued, what have I done that you should even me to dogs by such a supposition? I never yet failed a friend, and it's not likely I'll begin with you. There are things between us that I can never forget, even if you can. I will only say this to you, David, said Alan very quietly, that I have long been owing you my life, and now I owe you money. You should try to make that burden light for me. This ought to have touched me, and in a manner it did, but the wrong manner. I felt I was behaving badly, and was now not only angry with Alan, but angry with myself in the bargain, and it made me the more cruel. You asked me to speak, said I. Well, then I will. You own yourself that you have done me a disservice. I have had to swallow an affront. I have never reproached you. I never blamed the thing till you did. And now you blame me, cried I, because I cannot laugh and sing as if I was glad to be affronted. The next thing will be that I'm to go down upon my knees and thank you for it. You should think more of others, Alan Breck. If you thought more of others, you would perhaps speak less about yourself. And when a friend that likes you very well has passed over an offense without a word, you would be blithe to let it lie instead of making it a stick to break his back with. By your own way of it, it was you that was to blame. Then it shouldn't be you to seek the quarrel. Oh, weel, said Alan, say no more. And we fell back into our former silence and came to our journey's end, and supped and lay down to sleep without another word. The gillie put us across Loch Rannoch in the dusk of the next day and gave us his opinion as to our best route. This was to get us up at once into the tops of the mountains, to go round by a circuit, turning the heads of Glen Leob, Glen Lochay, and Glen Dochart, and come down upon the lowlands by Kippen and the upper waters of the Forth. Alan was little pleased with the route which led us through the country of his blood foes, the Glenorchy Campbells. He objected that by turning to the east we should come almost at once among the Athole Stewarts, a race of his own name and lineage, although following a different chief, and come besides by a far easier and swifter way to the place whither we were bound. But the gillie, who was indeed the chief man of Cluny's scouts, had good reasons to give him on all hands, naming the force of troops in every district, and alleging finally, as well I could understand, that we should nowhere be so little troubled as in a country of the Campbells. Alan gave way at last, but with only half a heart. It's one of the dowiest countries in Scotland, said he. There's nothing there that I ken but heath and crows and Campbells. But I see that you're a man of some penetration, and be it as you please. We set forth accordingly by this itinerary, and for the best part of 3 nights travelled on eerie mountains and among the wellheads of wild rivers, often buried in mist, almost continually blown and rained upon, and not once cheered by any glimpse of sunshine. By day we lay and slept in the drenching heather. By night incessantly clambered upon breakneck hills and among rude crags. We often wandered. We were often so involved in fog that we must lie quiet till it lightened. A fire was never to be thought of. Our only food was drammock and a portion of cold meat that we had carried from the cage, and as for drink, heaven knows we had no want of water. This was a dreadful time, rendered the more dreadful by the gloom of the weather and the country. I was never warm. My teeth chattered in my head. I was troubled with a very sore throat, such as I had on the isle. I had a painful stitch in my side, which never left me. And when I slept in my wet bed with the rain beating above and the mud oozing below me, it was to live over again in fancy the worst part of my adventures, to see the Tower of Shaws lit by lightning, Ransom carried below on the men's backs, Shuan dying on the roundhouse floor, or Colin Campbell grasping at the bosom of his coat. From such broken slumbers, I would be aroused in the gloaming to sit up in the same puddle where I had slept and sup cold drammock, the rain driving sharp in my face or running down my back in icy trickles, the mist enfolding us like as in a gloomy chamber, or perhaps if the wind blew, falling suddenly apart and showing us the gulf of some dark valley where the streams were crying aloud. The sound of an infinite number of rivers came up from all around. In this steady rain, the springs of the mountains were broken up. Every glen gushed water like a cistern. Every stream was in high spate and had filled and overflowed its channel. During our night tramps, it was solemn to hear the voices of them below in the valleys, now booming like thunder, now with an angry cry. I could well understand the story of the water kelpie, that demon of the streams who was fabled to keep wailing and roaring at the ford until the coming of the doomed traveler. Alan, I saw, believed it or half believed it, and when the cry of the river rose more than usually sharp, I was a little surprised, though of course I would still be shocked, to see him cross himself in the manner of the Catholics. During all these horrid wanderings we had no familiarity, scarcely even that of speech. The truth is that I was sickening for my grave, which is my best excuse. But besides that, I was of an unfortunate, unforgiving disposition from my birth, slow to take offense, slower to forget it, and now incensed both against my companion and myself. For the best part of 2 days he was unweariedly kind, silent indeed, but always ready to help and always hoping, as I could very well see, that my displeasure would blow by. For the same length of time I stayed in myself, nursing my anger, roughly refusing his services, and passing him over with my eyes as if he had been a bush or a stone. The second night, or rather the peep of the third day, found us upon a very open hill, so that we could not follow our usual plan and lie down immediately to eat and sleep. Before we had reached a place of shelter, the gray had come pretty clear, for though it still rained, the clouds ran higher, and Allen, looking in my face, showed some marks of concern. "Ye had better let me take your pack," said he, for perhaps the 9th time since we had parted from the scout beside Loch Rannoch. "I do very well, I thank you," said I, as cold as ice. Allen flushed darkly. "I'll not offer it again," he said. "I'm not a patient man, David." "I never said you were," said I, which was exactly the rude, silly speech of a boy of 10. Allen made no answer at the time, but his conduct answered for him. Henceforth, it is to be thought, he quite forgave himself for the affair at Cluny's, cocked his hat again, walked jauntily, whistled airs, and looked at me upon one side with a provoking smile. The third night we were to pass through the western end of the country of Balquhidder. It came clear and cold, with a touch in the air like frost, and a northerly wind that blew the clouds away and made the stars bright. The streams were full, of course, and still made a great noise among the hills, but I observed that Allen thought no more upon the Kelpie and was in high good spirits. As for me, the change of weather came too late. I had lain in the mire so long that, as the Bible has it, my very clothes abhorred me. I was dead weary, deadly sick, and full of pains and shiverings. The chill of the wind went through me, and the sound of it confused my ears. In this poor state I had to bear from my companion something in the nature of a persecution. He spoke a good deal, and never without a taunt. Whig was the best name he had to give me. "Here," he would say, "here's a dub for you to jump, my Wiggy. I ken you're a fine jumper," and so on, all the time, with a gibing voice and face. I knew it was my own doing, and no one else's, but I was too miserable to repent. I felt I could drag myself but little farther. Pretty soon I must lie down and die on these wet mountains like a sheep or a fox, and my bones must whiten there like the bones of a beast. My head was light, perhaps, but I began to love the prospect. I began to glory in the thought of such a death, alone in the desert, with the wild eagles besieging my last moments. Allen would repent then, I thought. He would remember when I was dead how much he owed me, and the remembrance would be torture. So I went like a sick, silly, and bad-hearted schoolboy, feeding my anger against a fellow man, when I would have been better on my knees, crying on God for mercy. And at each of Allen's taunts I hugged myself. "Ah," thinks I to myself, "I have a better taunt in readiness. When I lie down and die, you will feel it like a buffet in your face. Ah, what a revenge! Ah, how you will regret your ingratitude and cruelty." All the while I was growing worse and worse. Once I had fallen, my legs simply doubling under me, and this had struck Allen for the moment, but I was afoot so briskly and set off again with such a natural manner that he soon forgot the incident. Flushes of heat went over me, and then spasms of shuddering. The stitch in my side was hardly bearable. At last I began to feel that I could trail myself no farther, and with that there came on me all at once the wish to have it out with Allen, let my anger blaze, and be done with my life in a more sudden manner. He had just called me Whig. I stopped. "Mr. Stewart," said I, in a voice that quivered like a fiddle string, "you are older than I am, and should know your manners. Do you think it either very wise or very witty to cast my politics in my teeth? I thought, where folk differed, it was the part of gentlemen to differ civilly, and if I did not, I may tell you I could find a better taunt than some of yours." Allen had stopped opposite to me, his hat cocked, his hands in his breeches pockets, his head a little on one side. He listened, smiling evilly, as I could see by the starlight. And when I had done, he began to whistle a Jacobite air. It was the air made in mockery of General Cope's defeat at Prestonpans. Hey, Johnny Cope, are you walking yet? And are your drums a-beatin' yet? And it came in my mind that Allen, on the day of that battle, had been engaged upon the royal side. Why do you take that air, Mr. Stewart? Said I. Is that to remind me you have been beaten on both sides? The air stopped on Allen's lips. David, said he. But it's time these manners ceased, I continued, and I mean you shall henceforth speak civilly of my king and my good friends the Campbells. I am a Stuart, began Allen. Oh, says I can you bear a king's name? But you are to remember, since I have been in the Highlands, I have seen a good many of those that bear it, and the best I can say of them is this, that they would be none the worse of washing. Do you know that you insult me? Said Allen, very low. I am sorry for that, said I, for I am not done, and if you distaste the sermon, I doubt the purlique will please you as little. You have been chased in the field by the grown men of my party. It seems a poor kind of pleasure to outface a boy. Both the Campbells and the Whigs have beaten you. You have run before them like a hare. It behoves you to speak of them as your betters. Allen stood quite still, the tails of his greatcoat clapping behind him in the wind. This is a pity, he said at last. There are things said that cannot be passed over. I never asked you to, said I. I am as ready as yourself. Ready, said he. Ready, I repeated. I am no blower and boaster like some that I could name. Come on. And drawing my sword, I fell on guard as Allen himself had taught me. David, he cried, are you daft? I can't draw upon you, David. It's fair murder. That was your lookout when you insulted me, said I. It's the truth, cried Allen, and he stood for a moment wringing his mouth in his hand like a man in sore perplexity. It's the bare truth, he said, and drew his sword. But before I could touch his blade with mine, he had thrown it from him and fallen to the ground. Nah, he kept saying. Nah, I canna. At this, the last of my anger oozed all out of me, and I found myself only sick and sorry and blank and wondering at myself. I would have given the world to take back what I had said, but a word once spoken, who can recapture it? I minded me of all Allen's kindness and courage in the past, how he had helped and cheered and borne with me in our evil days, and then recalled my own insults, and saw that I had lost forever that doughty friend. At the same time, the sickness that hung upon me seemed to redouble, and the pang in my side was like a sword for sharpness. I thought I must have swooned where I stood. This it was that gave me a thought. No apology could blot out what I had said. It was needless to think of one. None could cover the offense. But where an apology was vain, a mere cry for help might bring Allen back to my side. I put my pride away from me. Allen, I said, if you canna help me, I must just die here. He started up sitting and looked at me. It's true, said I. I'm by with it. Oh, let me get into the bield of a house. Can die there easier. I had no need to pretend. Whether I chose or not, I spoke in a weeping voice that would have melted a heart of stone. Can you walk? Asked Allen. No, said I, not without help. This last hour my legs have been fainting under me. I've a stitch in my side like a red-hot iron. I canna breathe right. If I die, you can forgive me, Allen? In my heart I liked you fine, even when I was the angriest. Wheesht, cried Allen. Dinna say that. David, man, you can... He shut his mouth upon a sob. Let me get my arm about you, he continued. That's the way. Now lean upon me hard. Good kens where there's a house. We're in Balwhidder, too. There should be no want of houses, no, nor friends' houses here. Do ye gang easier so, Davy? Aye, said I can be doing this way, and I pressed his arm with my hand. Again he came near sobbing. Davy, said he, I know a right man at all. I have neither sense nor kindness. I couldna remember you were just a bairn. I couldna see you were dying on your feet. Davy, you'll have to try and forgive me. Oh, man, let's say no more about it, said I. We're neither one of us to mend the other, that's the truth. We must just bear and forbear, man Allen. Oh, but my stitch is sore. Is there no house? I'll find a house to you, David, he said stoutly. We'll follow down the burn where there's bound to be houses. My poor man, will you no be better on my back? Oh, Alan, says I, and me a good 12 inches taller? You're no such thing, cried Alan with a start. There may be a trifling matter of an inch or two. I'm no saying I'm just exactly what you would call a tall man, whatever, and I dare say, he added, his voice tailing off in a laughable manner, now when I come to think of it, I dare say you'll just about be a right. Aye, it'll be a foot or near hand, or maybe even more. It was sweet and laughable to hear Alan eat his words up in the fear of some fresh quarrel. I could have laughed had not my stitch caught me so hard, but if I had laughed, I think I must have wept too. Alan, cried I, what makes you so good to me? What makes you care for such a thankless fellow? Deed, and I don't know, said Alan, for just precisely what I thought I liked about you was that you never quarreled, and now I like you better. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.